The bright side of addiction is recovery. And recovery is as recovery does. And recovery is living proof. If you're new to the podcast, we welcome you. If you have been here before, we certainly welcome you back. And if you're in recovery or know or love someone who is, or you simply want to know more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love who's harmfully using alcohol or any other drug, well, this is the podcast for you. We carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder that you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have included actor John Larroquette, an interview with Buzz Aldrin, musician Bonnie Raitt, a great interview I did like 41 years ago with Betty Ford, even before the Betty Ford Center started. A lot of stuff there, including conversations with NFL players Ryan Leaf and Thomas Hollywood Henderson, authors Brene Brown and Anne Lamott, and a whole lot more. Plus, everyday people in long-term recovery, sharing their story, their insight, and their path. Now, as you may recall, if you're a regular listener of the Recovery Coast to Coast podcast, a few months back, as I mentioned, I found an interview with Mrs. Betty Ford. Well, I found another audio gem recently. This one was from, 30 years ago. Before Recovery Coast to Coast, I produced and hosted a local Seattle radio show called Straight Talk, Recovery Radio for the Northwest. And I recently found an interview I did with Bob Smitty Smith, the son of the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Here's a quick clip from that interview.
I was 17 when AA was first formed, June 10th of 1935. I'm 74 now. You see, I rode out with my father and mother to the home of Henrietta Seiberling on Mother's Day in Akron in 1935 to meet with Bill. And at that time, those two men went off and talked for several hours. My father had said to him, 15 minutes of this bird's all I want. He had a hangover. They went off and talked for several hours, and as a result of that meeting and at my mother's invitation, Bill came and he lived at our home all summer, and this is the time and place that AA was first started.
It's a fascinating interview. The full interview is coming right up. I'm Neil Scott, host of Recovery Coast to Coast. So thankful and so filled with gratitude that you chose to listen to our podcast. There's a lot of podcasts about recovery. I'm blessed and honored that you've chosen ours. Our website is recoverycoasttocoast.org. Following 17 years of nightly broadcasting on iHeartRadio in Seattle, our podcast features interviews with everyday people in long-term recovery, as well as clinicians, authors, and recovering celebrities who offer the promise of hope and the reality of recovery. Plus, well-vetted resources for individuals, families, and friends. We invite you to enjoy it and please to share it with your friends as well. Recovery is an American way of life. A reminder, our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. We always love to hear from you. Recovery Coast to Coast, supported by Sundown M Ranch, one of America's oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs. Sundown M Ranch is not a fancy resort-like treatment center, I can tell you that. What it is a not-for-profit program located not far from Seattle on 30 acres of land that they own at the mouth of the breathtaking Yakima River Canyon, which is why they have some of the lowest rates in the country, by the way. They are not-for-profit. They own their own land. Expenses are minimal, and they are covered by most insurance plans. Sundown M Ranch has a long and successful history of treating individuals and families, and they do so with a top-notch staff of addiction professionals. They have been on the front lines of treatment and recovery for the past 55 years, successfully treating well over 200,000 individuals and families. Nothing fancy, but a good, quality treatment program by a passionate and compassionate staff focused on the bottom line, not financial bottom line, but the bottom line of personal long-term recovery. At Sundown M Ranch, each patient is treated with dignity, respect, and compassion, and of course, the utmost in confidentiality. Their motto is, the patient is the reason we are here. Sundown, it's where recovery begins, sundown.org. All right, time for coffee, at least for me anyway. It's coffee time as I take you back to the early 1990s, probably around 1992 or 1993, when I was hosting a Seattle area radio show called Straight Talk Recovery Radio for the Northwest. My co-host for this particular program was a lovely woman in long-term recovery who unfortunately I lost track of over the ensuing years. Her name is Addie Hansen. Now I hope you enjoy this audio archive interview with a real legend, the son of the co-founder of AA, Bob Smitty Smith. The last time we met was in Seattle back in 1990. You were involved in a function over at the Seattle Center. And the thing I remember most was you talked about your wife being the incumbent.
Oh, yeah, true.
Listen, you have got a marvelous book that really chronicled you and your sister growing up as the children of Dr. Bob. Why did you write the book?
Well, I think it's a story that needed to be told, Neil, and also, you know, we're the only two left now, and neither one of us are young anymore. So before it gets distorted, and these things tend to, why we thought we'd present the story as we remembered it.
It really is important to keep the roots, to go back in time. And I think a lot of the newcomers who come into recovery really do not have an appreciation for the history and the struggles back in those early days.
Well, Neil, you know, I've always heard this said that when cultures or civilizations fail, they seem to have one common thread that happened, and that is they fail to remember where they came from.
For people who perhaps have never heard the actual words of Dr. Bob Smith, I was going through my archives the other night and found a copy of a talk, Bob, that your dad gave shortly before he died, I believe probably in the late 40s. And here's a little snippet of that.
You see, there in Akron, we have the extreme good fortune, as I guess many of you people know, of having a very nice hospital set up at St. Thomas Hospital. With a ward that theoretically accommodates 7, but statistically HSCs that is stretched a little bit, and she usually has about 2 or 3 more parked around somewhere.
The words of Dr. Bob Smith, and joining us tonight by phone is Bob Smith, who is the son of Dr. Bob.
Bob, how old were you when Bill W. came to your home?
I was 17 when AA was first formed.
Wow.
You know, June 10th of 1935. I'm 74 now.
Yeah. And do you, I'm sure you do, but do you remember very vividly the events that happened?
Yes, I do. You see, I rode out with my father and mother to the home of Henrietta Seiberling on Mother's Day in Akron in 1935 to meet with Bill. And at that time, those 2 men went off and talked for several hours. My father had said, 15 minutes of this bird's all I want. He had a hangover.
Mm-hmm.
But they went off and talked for several hours, and as a result of that meeting and at my mother's invitation, Bill came and he lived at our home all summer, and this is the time and place that AA was first started.
That's fabulous. Did you feel the power? Did you understand at that time the importance of what was happening?
No, Eddie, I really didn't. You got to understand that I was not one of the deepest thinkers in the world. My thoughts were more along the lines of getting a squirrel tail to put on the aerial of my Chevy. So I didn't really realize that history was being made, and I think that's often the case.
Yeah.
There were a lot of struggles around that time. Obviously, we live in a time now where there's practically Kentucky Fried treatment. There's a treatment center on every corner. To a large extent, the stigma has been significantly reduced. But, gosh, back in 1935, there was a lot of prejudice, and obviously you were bringing a lot of drunks into your home. What was it like as far as your peers were concerned, the neighbors? You know, even today it's hard to get a halfway house in a neighborhood. My God, what was it like back in Akron?
Well, it was a difficult time, and thank goodness the original people stuck with it and hung in there tough, because they were thought of as a cult, a bunch of nuts, and we were taking people in our home. And so, well, if you want to get an idea what it's like, just start a halfway house in your own home and see how popular you are with the neighbors. In fact, we even got asked to leave the Presbyterian Church, and I never heard of anybody getting kicked out of the Presbyterian Church before, but we were.
Because of what was going on in your home.
Yes, right. And AA.
Is really giving a service of yourself, and that almost invariably, not always, but almost invariably requires some effort and some time of your own. It isn't a matter of putting a little quiet money in the dish. That helps, and possibly that's indicated too. But that isn't giving much. That is for the average individual in days like this when most people get along at least fairly well.
And the actual voice of Dr. Bob back in the late 40s. Visiting with us by phone is Bob Smith, Children of the Healer. And we had a call from Ted who wanted to know, Bob, what was it like growing up during the drinking days living with your dad?
Well, I can talk about that also. You know, the first 17 years of my life was raised in a home with active alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those of us who are in that situation, and I'm finding out there are very many of us now, we develop our own way to cope. And I was a runner. That's the way I handled it. I got out of that house as fast as I could and stayed as long as I decently could without getting in trouble with my parents. And I resented the poverty that the alcoholism and the times had forced upon us, and I became pretty materialistically minded. I think each of us develops their own way of coping because, we will cope.
In the story, obviously, there were a lot of people brought into the home and being treated. I'm not sure if it was in the book or whether I heard you say this in a talk one time about when you and your sister went into the home and you smelled formaldehyde, you knew that you probably would lose your bed for the night.
You must remember that there are no medical people associated with this fledgling movement at the time, so Dr. Bob was the only medical man, and they treated him in the home because hospital beds they're only $16 for a double, but nobody had the $16. So Dr. Bob would take him upstairs and say, now, fella, I'm going to give you a little shot of whiskey, but I want you to take this medicine first, and it was tincture of formaldehyde. And formaldehyde is a very pungent sedative.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've ever smelled it, I guarantee you'd never forget it. So what the reference you make is when my sister and I were coming home from school, we'd open the front door. If we smelled formaldehyde, we figured we lost our bed.
Did you resent that at all, Bob?
Heck no, I didn't. We were just tickled at that. Things were so much better. And really, it was fun. You got to understand, these people weren't overnight guests. Arch T, who went on and started AA in Detroit, was there almost a year.
Wow.
And so the pleasure was seeing, the blank eyes, and pretty soon, a little recovery, you begin to see a light in the eyes, and pretty soon you got a viable, fun human being on your hands. And it was such an improvement. It was great.
And, you talk about in the book how when Bill was staying there, he really ignored you kids, and to a great extent, you really didn't know what was going on. He never really sat down and talked to you, and obviously there was a lot of activity going on in your home.
Well, you see, we didn't have, I don't know, in alcoholism in our family, we never discussed it unless my mother made us. So we weren't just too really hepping up on it. And, of course, these two men were very, very busy. They were staying up till 3 and 4 in the morning over a little wooden kitchen table we had, trying to come up with a plan that would work for other alcoholics. So they had their hands full.
Bill played the violin.
Yeah, Bill told me one time that he took off a year of his life to learn to play the violin, brought it with him, and I tell you, he was no hyphus, so I figured it was an awful waste.
Your role in a lot of that, as I understand the story, was you made a mean pot of coffee.
Oh, yeah. See, I didn't even drink the stuff at the time, but we bought coffee 9 pounds at a whack. The A&P was just dirt cheap, And there was always a coffee pot going. You got to understand that nobody had any work. Times were terrible, but they had time to communicate. And I think that's one of the strengths and perhaps arranged by our Heavenly Father.
Bob, when did you realize that did you come to the realization that, gee, I'm a grown-up child of an alcoholic, and it's had an effect on me? When did that occur to you?
Well, really not until a later date. This may sound kind of stupid to you, but I really didn't think I was greatly affected until this COA movement started coming on, and then I realized that, it does affect you. And, of course, some people were affected a lot worse than I am.
It says, in the autumn of 1935, when Dad and Bill started AA, although it didn't have a name then, I first met Ernie. I met him through AA. I guess it was supposed to be that way. The Lord has more than one way to get you down on your knees. He didn't hit me with the bottle. He hit me with Ernie. Tell me more about Ernie.
Hey, Ernie was generally considered to be AA number 4.
Right.
And he married my sister, Sue, much against my folks' wishes because he was quite a bit older.
Mm-hmm.
And Ernie had periods of sobriety, and then he would have breaks in his sobriety. So that's what she's referring to. She had to see him through some of his drunken times, too.
And we had a call from Mary who wanted to know, what role did her play in all of this?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. My mother was the one that was a friend of Henrietta Seiberling.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother was the one that invited Bill to come and live at our home. And, you think about that. Now, that's kind of a little miracle. I can imagine inviting somebody over for dinner. But can you imagine inviting somebody to stay the whole summer?
No.
And then can you imagine him accepting it? And Lois, his wife, came down, visited with us a couple weeks, and she had to get back to work because you got to realize that at the time, Lois was the only one that had a job.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is the lady that started the Quiet Times, and this is the lady that attended the Oxford group, from which we have a basis and a debt of gratitude, and this is the lady that made the beds and cooked the food and made the phone calls and cleaned up the messes, and she was an absolute angel. Well, Bill himself said Ann Smith is the mother of AA, and I truly believe it.
But when we take time to find out and familiarize ourselves with and put into practice some of the spiritual laws which it is necessary to follow to acquire those things, then we find that we get them. And I think I've had them in very large measure. Those two things, happiness and peace of mind. And I feel most extremely fortunate, and I feel very grateful and thankful that our Heavenly Father has seen fit that I enjoy them.
And the words of Dr. Bob Smith, one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. Children of the Healer is the book, the story of Dr. Bob's kids, by Bob Smith and Sue Smith Windows. Where is your sister living now, Bob?
She still lives in Akron.
Still lives in Akron?
Not too often, every few years, yes.
All right. We had a call from Michael who wanted to know what kind of a doctor your dad was. Was he an alcoholism specialist?
No.
I'll let you answer the question because I know.
Well, the first part of his medical career, he was a general practitioner. Then he went back in 1929, just before the crash, and studied under the Mayo brothers in Rochester, Minnesota, and became a proctologist, a surgeon.
And certainly back in those days, there were no alcoholism specialists.
Oh, no. And, of course, he didn't have much practice either because the 1929 crash came along, and this surgery that he did was dependent on references from other doctors, and they all knew he was a drunk.
Did he maintain any long-term sobriety before meeting Bill at all?
Not that I know of, no.
So it was pretty much just...
Now, he tried desperately to quit. He turned himself into some of the places that he thought might help. He desperately wanted to quit and just couldn't do it.
I want to know, I guess maybe the female point of view or perspective, that I just want to know how you felt growing up. How did you feel about your dad when you were younger, or when you were younger and he was still drinking? Did you have animosity, or were you, just how did you feel?
Well, let me explain this to you. He wasn't an obstreperous drunk. He wasn't out thumbing his nose on the front lawn with the neighbors. He was a quiet got drunk, never drove when he was drinking. He had the boys at Central Garage. They liked old Doc. They'd bring his car home, and we'd help him upstairs, and he'd pass out. And when he was sober, he was a wonderful guy. So how do you feel? You feel neglected, maybe? You feel hurt? You feel disgust? You feel sort of alone? You get all kinds of feelings, and others in the same situation. You know, I didn't have the fear, but I had some of the other emotions.
And then as then 1935 comes, he doesn't drink anymore, and you know this time that it's real, that it's going to happen, that it's happened. And when did you? I mean, was there like an acceptance of hey, this is it, this is for real?
Yeah, it took a little while though, because you'd think, maybe for right now, you know, when will it end, and so forth. But then, with the enthusiasm and these other people coming in and communicating all the time, and you realize that this is a real thing. Why, recovery was just absolutely fabulous. It was fun, and he was a neat guy. Anyone would have loved Doc.
And he gave and he helped anyone and everyone. Isn't that true?
Yes, you know, he was 10 years older than Bill. He was 55 when he sobered up, and he only lived another 15 years. In the last 5 years of his life, he was terminally ill with cancer. But in that length of time when he was active, he personally took care of over 5,000 alcoholics, AA-wise and medical-wise, without charge.
That's amazing. That's great.
Julie Call wanted to know, what do you remember most about your dad? What is your favorite reminiscence?
Well, he was, I'll tell you, he was the type of a man that was very highly educated, yet anybody could talk to Doc. He loved the slang of the day, and I'm not talking about the four-letter words. And he wasn't all stuffed up with his own feelings. You know, he and a boyfriend of mine toured New England and up into Canada one time, and an old Ford Roadster that I had didn't even have a top on it. And I said, Dad, this thing hasn't got any top on it. What are we going to do when it rains? And he says, we're going to get wet.
Talk about his sense of humor, Bob.
He was absolutely had a marvelous sense of humor. So when I brought my wife home, for the first time, for the folks to look over in the early 40s, my wife's tall and thin. My father looked at her, and he got me aside and said, she's built for speed and light housekeeping.
There are some marvelous pictures in the book. Obviously, you went back into your family collection and really have shared these with people, again, to make that strong connection.
Yes, luckily we have some pictures that were preserved, and I was glad to share them.
Somebody called and I didn't get their name, but they wanted to know what you thought of the movie My Name is Bill W.
Oh, I loved it. I loved it. I understand that one of the producers had 28 years in the program, so he had the right slant. And, you know, James Wood even looked like Bill, parted his hair the same way. And I happened to hear an interview with Donahue, and they were interviewing James Garner and James Wood, and I'll tell you, James Wood knew more about AA than most alcoholics.
You know, I saw that same interview, and you're absolutely right. It was it was eerie.
Yeah, really. I thought, gee, you talk about doing your homework. Now, that gentleman had done it.
Did you know Marty Mann at all, Bob?
Yes, I did. I knew Marty. Uh-huh.
We're visiting tonight with the son of one of the co-founders of AA, Dr. Bob Smith. Bob Smith joining us, discussing the book Children of the Healer. In the book, it talks about your dad calling you Smith and calling your sister T.
Uh-huh.
Why in the world would someone named Sue be called T?
Well, he loved nicknames for everybody. You know, he called Bill Willie. And Willie called him Smithy. Can you imagine these two grown men, dignified founders, doing that? But, of course, I got my name because my last name was Smith. And,
right.
And
well, that makes sense.
He had come across a fictional character, somebody Twitch Bottom, so he called Sue T for Twitch Bottom.
Oh, okay. Michael called and wanted to know what was the Oxford group.
Okay. The Oxford group was organization founded by a Lutheran minister by the name of Frank Buckman from Pennsylvania. And the basic tenets of the Oxford group was back to simple first-century Christianity. And it came to Akron because one of Harvey Firestone's children had been sobered up by the Oxford group.
Mm-hmm.
And so he welcomed him. Harvey was, of course, the owner of Firestone Tire and Rubber Company and a mover and shaker in Akron. And he welcomed these people with open arms, and that's how it came to Akron. But basically, that's the Oxford group.
How did you wind up down in Texas? You live down in Texas now from Akron, Ohio.
Well, I'd been a bomber pilot in World War II,
Mm-hmm.
and I got a flying job for a corporation out of Dallas. And I came down here, and then formed an oil field service and tool company with another fella. And later on, he bought me out, and I moved up here to Nocona, where I live now. There's a shallow oil field out here. I bought a shallow part of it, and that's what kept me here.
Did not get the name of the caller, but someone called, wanted to know, what do you remember about Sister Ignatia?
Well, I knew Sister quite well. She was a lovely, lovely lady. And there's a book out about Sister. I remember her that she was a very small, dignified little lady with a quiet, melodic voice, but she had an aura about her. And when Sister said something, everyone understood that that's the way it's going to be. Since she was very fond of Dr. Bob and he of her.
Once your dad sobered up, did he resume his medical practice?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did, and he was successful.
Let's see, Dale from Sandpoint wanted to know, how does it feel to hear your father's voice now? We've been playing these clips throughout the hour from one of the last talks your dad gave. How does it feel when you hear that?
Well, you know, I remember a great guy, just a wonderful man and a father, and a man that had, he just did so much service to the world that I'm just, I was comforted and really proud of him. That talk you've been playing was the one he gave in Detroit,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the only full talk he ever gave.
Hmm.
And there's one in 1950, the first international, but he was terminally ill there and just talked for a short while.
I think the one that we're playing now, the one in Detroit, was probably, about 1948?
Yeah, somewhere along in there, right.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
The question might arise, well, we know what A's done in the last 15 years, but how about it from here on? Where do we go from here? Our membership, I think, is conservatively estimated at present around 70,000. Will it be in the increase from here on? Well, that'll depend on every member of AA.
The words of Dr. Bob Smith, one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. Children of the Healer. We're absolutely delighted tonight to have Bob Smith joining us, the son of Dr. Bob. He's on the phone lines, and so are you on our phone lines. We have a number of questions off the air. We also have Bob over on the east side. One Bob talking to another Bob. Hello, Bob on the east side. How are you?
Say, just fine, Smitty. Say, how's the presence of what was the name of that book I laid on you? Remember from the Birds of the Feather when you were here and.
Yeah, I remember that. I sure do, and I remember you because we're both old aviators.
Right on.
Well, that's wonderful.
The best of Betty.
Thank you.
And she's lovely, and so is your sister. And I've got a Birds of a Feather thing I was gonna send you, and I don't know whether just to send it to the PO there at Texas. Do they know you down there, Nakano?
Yeah, they know me.
You're the mayor of the town, aren't you?
Okay, well, I got a Birds of a Feather flyer I'm gonna send down there.
Fine, do it.
And just love meeting you. Looking forward to 95 down there at
San Diego.
And I'll tell you, you bet you're sweet that gonna have that book of yours in every library up here now.
Well, thank you, Bob.
Bob from the east side, thanks for the call.
Best of luck now.
Thank you very much. same to you.
Smitty, you are the mayor of your town, are you not?
Yeah, right.
How the...
All right.
Of course, the town is not exactly the size of Seattle, is it not?
It's a little smaller.
A little smaller.
Like 2,870. I have a friend that I correspond with in AA up in Alaska, and he said, you probably weren't even elected. It was just your turn.
Somebody wanted to know some of the history behind and some of your recollections of the first big book.
Well, you know, the first big book was, when it was written, the stories were, let's see, 17 of them were from the Akron area and 11 from the New York area. And some of them were written on our dining room table with a pencil. And luckily, in the Akron area, we had a man and he helped the boys with their stories, but you couldn't give the book away. Nobody wanted it. It was a drug on the market. It had a red and yellow jacket on it. It said Alcoholics Anonymous across it, you know. And the guys used to turn the jacket inside out so that you couldn't see what the book was.
Well, those books today certainly are worth something as collector's items.
Oh, they're a real treasure. Gee, they're worth from $2,500 to $20,000, I guess, or more.
I've had the opportunity on a number of occasions in New York to go through the archives over at GSO, and boy, to see some of those things and the history that's involved in that is absolutely fascinating.
Well, they've done a marvelous job, I think, of preserving the history of the movement for people that are interested.
We're visiting by phone with Bob Smith, Children of the Healer. I'm Neil Scott.
Bob, I don't know if you're aware, you maybe so, that this area, the Pacific Northwest, specifically Seattle, has more AA meetings per capita than any city in the U.S. You know, we have over 1,200 meetings per week here. And I wonder, I mean, it would be hard probably to say, but could you have a guess of what your dad would say to something like that?
Did he have any idea what was happening, the magnitude of this fellowship?
I don't believe that Dr. Bob could visualize that. He was more the steady, plodding type, you know, but I believe Bill could have. Mm-hmm. Bill was a visionary.
Yeah.
And I think if anybody could have imagined it, it would have been Bill Wilson.
Did they get along?
Oh, they loved each other. Never had an argument.
Never had an argument.
Wow.
Total opposites. Two people, you can imagine two more opposite.
What do you remember about the time that he stayed in your house? What were some of the memories of Bill?
Well, you know, they stayed up, he and Dr. Bob stayed up real late every night. They both drank a lot of coffee, and they both smoked cigarettes, and they talked about this program over and over, you know, stay up 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. But Bill was an easy guy to live with. He was a laid-back guy, and Bill played the violin, and my father, I'm sure he was kidding. He said his ambition in life dance and have curly hair.
So in the year, or in the summer that Bill stayed there with your family, and you got a chance to watch this relationship grow, do you know what kind of effect that has, you know, now that you're older, what kind of effect and did it have on you as a person?
Well, you know, these programs, if you're interested in them, will show you a way of life that you might not be smart enough to figure out yourself. I think they're invaluable to people with all sorts of interest in those things.
You certainly have seen this field of addiction go from back in 1935 when Bill came to your house, when the treatment centers were virtually non-existent. There was some certainly Towns Hospital and some places where people went to dry out, but they really weren't successful. All the way up through the 80s and now into the 90s, where people are going into treatment all the time. It must be amazing to have seen the growth over the years.
Well, yeah, but you know, it had to happen that way, as I see it, because one-on-one with the individual members, they never would have been able to handle the volume that the treatment centers made possible. Have you thought of it that way?
No, that's a good point.
If we remember the simplicity of our program, if we continue to remember that our job is to get sober and to stay sober and to help our less fortunate brother in doing the same thing, I doubt very much if we shall have any trouble, and we shall continue to grow and thrive and prosper.
Words of Dr. Bob Smith, Children of the Healer. His son, Smitty, Bob Smith, joining us by phone. Book published by Parkside, Children of the Healer. Somebody wanted to know why it took so long to write the book. You're obviously, what did you say, 74 years old?
Yes.
Why a book at 74? Why did it take so long to do the book?
Well, I guess that you being not being near any Mecca or a city, or any publication facilities, it just took a long time for a publisher to be interested in to contact us.
Was there any reluctance on your sister's part at all?
No, I don't think so. She pretty well tells she's got a kind of a tragic story, and she tells it.
Yeah, the book is divided into two parts. Your sister's part begins the book, and then your part is later in the book.
Right.
Your dad was really pretty well physically up until he developed cancer. Having grown up in the home and saw what alcoholism did, and then saw the miracle of recovery with the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and suddenly the new lease on life, then he gets hit with this other terrible disease. What was going on for you when he was diagnosed with cancer?
Well, of course, I wasn't living in Akron at the time. I had this flying job out of Dallas, and I know that he did suffer, and fortunately, he had a couple that came and lived with him. My mother had died the year before he did, and so I hated to see this happen to such a great guy, but the only thing I can tell you is he just took it like a man.
You end the book by talking about fixing up a Greyhound bus and getting ready to go on the road. Has that happened?
Yeah, we've been driving it.
Do you speak around the country? Do you out promoting the book?
I'm doing some of that. Yes, I am.
What is it like for you when people come up to you that have so much reverence for your dad, for the fellowship, for the miracle that happened in your home? How does it affect you?
Well, of course, it's not anything to my credit, but I love to see it because this man was truly devoted to the service of suffering alcoholics and always kept his humility. He said he'd only been used as an agent.
Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the clips that we had earlier talked about when he said that he really was an agent and a man that really seemed to enjoy life on life's terms.
Yes, he really did. People tried to put he and Bill both up on pedestals, and Dr. Bob would just have none of it.
What do you remember about Lois?
Oh, Lois was a lovely person. She was, when I first saw her, she was just as cute as a button. Very small woman, very bright-eyed, very bright disposition. She's a real nice person.
Bob, do you have a family of your own?
Yes, got 4 grown children.
And that's fabulous. And are they of understanding and realization of their ancestry?
Yeah, but I hate to say it, Addie, but none of them have developed a problem so far, so they really aren't just vitally interested.
Oh, they're interested in knowing their family, and they're real proud, I'm sure.
Yeah, they know that it's there, but they're pursuing their own lives.
That's great.
The story of Children of the Healer, the story of Dr. Bob's kids finally being told. I, again, can't understand why it hasn't been told until now, but I'm absolutely delighted that you were approached and that Parkside Publishing agreed to put this out. Because, again, I think that the stories need to be told. You and your sister, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, are really the only ones that are around today that can, on a first-hand account, tell the story of what it was like at the beginning of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. Are you still promoting the book around the country? Are you doing a lot of talk shows?
I do some of them, yes, sure. I'm glad to do them.
Good. Well, we are delighted to have you here with us, and I know that it's later in Texas than it is in Seattle, and we appreciate you staying up late tonight, Bob.
Well, I've enjoyed being with you, Neil, and Addie also.
Outstanding.
Thank
Thanks
you,
so
Bob.
much, and continued success, and God bless you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank
All
you.
right. That was Smitty, the story of Dr. Bob's kids, children of the healer. Well, I hope you enjoyed my interview with Smitty, Bob Smitty Smith, the son of the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Smitty passed away back in July of 2004, nearly 20 years ago. By the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast that if you'd like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path that you've chosen, and as long as you've been in continuous recovery for a year or more, drop us a note at recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Coming up next, actress Ai McGraw with reflections on maturity in recovery.
Are you afraid? Afraid of life without drugs and alcohol? There is help and hope at Sundown M Ranch. At Sundown, the focus is on you and your disease. You will learn how to live without depending on drugs and alcohol. Sundown M Ranch is nationally recognized for effective and affordable alcohol and drug treatment programs. Reclaim your life. Replace your fears with hope. Go to www.sundown.org right now to learn more.
And now, as promised, some thoughts on maturity in recovery by award-winning actress and a woman in long-term recovery, actress Ai McGraw.
When we realized just how immature we were, many of us felt overwhelmed. It seemed unlikely that we would ever catch up. As with so many other fundamental changes, however, maturity came to us a day at a time, and as the result of many actions and experiences. We began to grow by doing what was in front of us without running away. Instead of immediately quitting a job that became difficult, for example, we learned to walk through the fear and discomfort and matured by doing so. Instead of breaking up a relationship that felt too close, we tried to become more open and vulnerable and matured in the process. We also gain maturity by taking responsibility for our actions on a daily basis, by acknowledging mistakes and shortcomings, and by making amends. In addition, and perhaps most important, we worked hard at becoming rigorously self-honest at all times and in all situations. When we wondered aloud after several months if we were ever going to make real progress in becoming more mature, our friends assured us with unmistakable sincerity that we already had. Thought for today: I will do what is in front of me. I won't sidestep or run away.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And if you've enjoyed our podcast, you could really do us a big favor by sharing it with others, at least one other person. You can find all of our podcasts, by the way, at recoverycoasttocoast.org. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, our email, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. And please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. Remember, if you know someone who is experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here is a 24-hour national helpline that offers free information and confidential treatment referrals. Spanish-speaking individuals are available as well. The number is 1-800-622-HELP. Pretty easy to remember. And we encourage you to check out findsupport.gov. It's a fairly new website designed for individuals, families, and friends, including information on how to pay for treatment, including low-cost and some free treatment options as well. You'll find health care support, how to help someone else, or find help for yourself. It's all in one place, findsupport.gov. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another shout-out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins, sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.